What you're about to hear is in scripture, it is in history, and it isn't meant to offend anyone's beliefs. This is just how my mind works. It questions, it spirals, it plays with threads that don't line up, and asks why they were cut in the first place. I was taught the story of the flood. Maybe you were too. But the more I looked at it, the more I realized some parts don't make sense. Some parts were conveniently left out, and some parts, I think, were drowned on purpose. This episode isn't here to tell you what to believe. It's not disrespectful. It's just honest, curious, and a little unhinged, like all good stories should be. So if your hands are already reaching for the ark, or the scroll, or the memory that hums beneath the floodline, then you're exactly where you're meant to be. Let's dive in. Hello everyone, welcome to another Bloodline episode. Thank you for being here still if you are, and if you're not, nothing against. I hope you are all doing well. I hope life is treating you well, or at least with kindness and softness, and if not, then look within yourself for your kindness and the softness that you need. And soak up the good moments, soak up the good emotions that come from other people. And once they stop feeling okay, then just follow your own need for whatever you need. Space, quiet, solitude, company, socializing, whatever you need. Anyways, let's stop talking because I can just go on for hours asking about how you guys are and how I would like life to treat you and all of that. So without further ado, here we go. There was a man. In a time when the world had gone mad, when bloodlines were tangled, beasts were twisted, and creation itself was spiraling out of tune, there was a man. Genesis chapter 6 verse 9 gives him to us. Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God. Just, perfect in his generations, walked with God. That's the Sunday school Noah. Noble, faithful, obedient, the man with a hammer in one hand and a dove in the other. But let's not just nod along, because if you flip just 3 verses forward, you find this. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. All flesh, not most or many, all, every beast, every bird, every creeping thing, all twisted, mutated, and ruined. So if the entire earth was contaminated, then how in all realms was Noah still pure? Did he live in a bubble? Did corruption skip his postcode? Or are we dealing with convenient narrative logic here? Because if all flesh was ruined, yet Noah was not, either he was set apart for a reason, or someone's leaving out a whole lot of detail. The text doesn't just call Noah righteous, it calls him perfect in his generations. That little phrase hides a fault line. The Hebrew word is tamim, and tamim doesn't just mean upright. It means unblemished, whole, without defect. The same word used for the lamb you'd bring to sacrifice. Flawless, no scars, no missing parts. So was Noah morally good, or genetically intact? Because the way Genesis frames it, Noah is one of the last uncorrupted threads in a tapestry that's already falling apart. And that takes us back to his lineage. He descends from Enoch, the man who didn't die, just vanished from the page. And if you remember what we uncovered before, you know his story doesn't end in Genesis. It continues in the parts that were cut out. The Watchers, the judgment, the knowledge they decided we shouldn't inherit. And in his book, the reason for the flood is spelled out. Not just because people were bad, but because creation itself had been tampered with. The Watchers descended. They broke the boundary. They bred hybrids, the Nephilim. And corruption spread through all flesh. So if Noah's Tamim, then this wasn't about moral perfection. It was about blood. And that turns the flood into something darker than a morality tale. It becomes a reset, a selective purge of corrupted code. And that still leaves the questions hanging. Where did Noah come from? How did his wife and his sons and their wives stay untouched? Were they isolated, hidden, protected? Or is the text simply airbrushing the details? Now let's step back, because we all know the story, or at least the polished picture book version of it. God looks down, the world is corrupt, violence fills the earth. So he picks one man, gives him impossible instructions, and sets the countdown clock ticking. In Genesis chapter 6 verse 14, it says, "Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Rooms shalt thou make in the ark, and shall pitch it within and without with pitch." The dimensions are absurdly specific. 300 cubits long, 50 wide, 30 high. That's about the length of a football pitch, stacked with 3 levels and sealed into a single vessel. 1 door, 1 window, 3 decks. And then comes the cargo list, in verse 19. "And of every living thing of all flesh, 2 of every sort shalt thou bring into the ark, to keep them alive with thee. They shall be male and female." 2 of every kind. Neat, simple, manageable for a children's mural. But turn the page to Genesis chapter 7 verse 2, and suddenly the story stutters. "Of every clean beast thou shalt take to thee by 7s, the male and his female, and of beasts that are not clean by 2, the male and his female. 7 pairs of the clean, 2 of the unclean, and birds also 7s. So, which is it? 2 of each, or 7 pairs of some and 2 of others? It's déjà vu, isn't it? The same reset we saw back in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2, 2 overlapping creation stories stitched together side by side, never fully smoothed. And we're expected not to notice. The ark is built, the animals come in, the door closes, and the rain begins. In Genesis chapter 7 verse 11 it says, "In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened." Now I have to be honest, this part took me a long time to wrap my head around, because I was taught the same version most of us were taught, that the flood was a worldwide event, a single global catastrophe. End of story. So when I started reading more closely and came across phrases like the fountains of the great deep and the windows of heaven, I just couldn't quite picture it. It sounded almost chaotic, even contradictory, like water coming from above and below at the same time. And that's exactly where things start to shift. Because once you slow down and stop reading it like modern weather, rain, storms, flooding, and start reading it as ancient worldview, something else appears underneath it. In that older way of seeing the world, the Earth isn't floating in space like we imagine today. It's more like a structured world, held in place, with waters above the sky, waters beneath the Earth, and land in between. So when the text says windows of heaven, it's not talking about clouds opening. It's describing the idea that something above the sky, something held back, is released. And when it says fountains of the deep, it's not talking about groundwater or rivers overflowing. The Hebrew word there, tehom, isn't just water. It is the deep, the primordial chaos, the abyss that existed before order. The same word echoes all the way back to Genesis chapter 1. Darkness was upon the face of the deep. So what's being described here isn't groundwater or flooding rivers, but the chaos waters beneath the earth breaking through. The picture the text is giving is not just heavy rain. It's a collapse of boundaries, above and below, both giving way at the same time. And once you see it like that, something interesting happens. The flood stops feeling like just a story about rain. It becomes something bigger than weather, something almost like the world itself is being undone and rewritten at the same time. But the text doesn't slow down to explain that. It just keeps moving. The flood lasts 40 days and nights. The waters rise. Every hill is covered. Every living thing outside the ark drowns. After 150 days, the waters recede. The ark rests on the mountains of Ararat. Noah sends out a raven, then a dove, and she returns with an olive leaf. And finally, the rainbow, God's bow in the clouds, a covenant, a post-it note that says, never again will he flood the earth. Neat, clean, Sunday school ready. But the cracks are already showing. 2 animals or 14? 40 days or 150? The story wants to sound seamless, but the seams are right there, splitting under the weight of the water. And if Genesis tries to settle itself back into rainbow light and covenant language, there's another tradition sitting just beneath it, quieter in the canon, heavier in tone. The Book of Enoch doesn't describe the flood the same way at all, because there, the flood isn't about violence or wickedness, it's about contamination. The book First of Enoch, chapter 10, verses 1 to 3, gives us the scene like this. Go to Noah and tell him in my name, hide thyself, and reveal to him the end that is approaching, that the whole earth will be destroyed, and a deluge is about to come upon the whole earth, and will destroy all that is on it. Here the flood is no sad divine sigh, no disappointed parent hitting reset. It's a surgical purge, a deliberate extermination. The watchers broke the boundaries, the Nephilim twisted creation, and the flood is the scalpel, cutting away everything that didn't belong. So Sunday school hands us animals 2 by 2 and a rainbow bow, but the forbidden text hands us something much darker, a flood not of morality but biology, a reset not of wickedness, but of blood. We've just met Noah the Sunday school way, a righteous man, blameless, obedient, the safe hero of the flood. But in the Forbidden Scrolls, in the book's later traditions buried beneath the canon, Noah's beginning doesn't feel safe at all. The Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees both preserve a version of his birth that unsettles his own family. Lamech, his father, is the first to notice something is off. Noah arrives radiant, not just healthy, luminous. Quote from 1 Enoch Qumran fragments. His body was white as snow and radiant with color like a blooming rose. The hair of his head was white like wool, and his eyes like the rays of the sun. When he opens his eyes, the house fills with light. This isn't the image of a quiet child. It's something else entirely, something not fully ordinary. In the Book of Jubilees, chapter 4, verses 15 and 16, Lamech panics and goes to Methuselah and says, "This child is not like us. He looks like the children of the angels." And Methuselah, unsettled himself, goes to Enoch. And Enoch answers with something stranger still. "Do not fear. This child is chosen. He is destined to survive what is coming." So let's pause here, because if this is the Noah behind the flood story, then we're not looking at a simple moral hero. We're looking at someone marked from the beginning, set apart not just by character, but by condition, a life already positioned for survival. And that pattern isn't unique. In Mesopotamian myth, Atrahasis is chosen and warned while the rest of humanity is erased by divine decision. In the Epic of Gilgamesh tradition, Utnapishtim is singled out, instructed to survive what others cannot. In Greek myth, Deucalion and Pyrrha are preserved by Zeus, not because they are morally superior, but because they are selected. And in Hindu tradition, Manu is warned by a fish, guided to preservation while the flood resets the world. Different names, different cultures, same structure repeating. A single figure is marked, warned, and carried through destruction, not as reward, but as selection. So what do we do with Noah in this light? The child who glows in his cradle, the one his father doubts is fully like them, the one preserved before the flood even begins. Is this righteousness or selection? Faith or function? Because if Noah is already set apart before the story of obedience even starts, then the flood was never simply about survival of the good. It was about survival of something specific, something carefully preserved, something chosen. And suddenly the ark doesn't look like salvation anymore. It looks like a vault, not just for life, but for something the story refuses to name directly, a memory sealed in wood, a bloodline too important to lose. But here's the part that makes me do a double take every time. Noah didn't just obey. He obeyed something that had never been seen. Genesis chapter 2 verse 5 says, "For the Lord God had not caused it to rain upon the earth, but there went up a mist from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground." Mist, dew, fountains from the deep. That's how creation drank. Rain from the sky? That concept didn't exist. And yet here's Noah, sawing, hammering, sweating, building a floating barn the size of a stadium, for something no one had ever experienced. For rain. According to certain traditions, like the rabbis in the Midrash, Noah kept this up for 120 years. 120 years of labor, of side-eye from the neighbors, 120 years of being the village lunatic, ranting about a sky flood no one had ever imagined. The Midrash even says God made him build it slowly on purpose, so the world would have time to repent. Spoiler alert? Yeah, they didn't. But imagine the scene. Noah, repent! The sky is going to open. And the crowd, the sky opens? And Noah, yes, and it's going to rain and flood. And the crowd, what's rain? And what is a flood? So instead of a prophet, Noah becomes something else entirely. A warning, a joke, a man wasting a century hammering a box in the desert. Now here's the kicker. None of this is in the Bible. Open Genesis chapter 6 to 7, and you won't find neighbors mocking him. You won't find side-eye. You won't find anyone whispering behind his back about a sky flood or calling him a lunatic. The text is almost disturbingly silent on how the people reacted. The New Testament adds one line in the book of 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 5, calling him a preacher of righteousness. But it doesn't describe ridicule, disbelief, or social scorn. That drama, that comes from later interpretations, folklore, and midrashic expansion. In other words, the Bible gives you the skeleton, the mockery, the isolation, the side-eye from the village. That's moral storytelling layered on top. It's teaching us something about human stubbornness, obedience, and endurance, but it's not the literal narrative. And that leaves something even more unsettling, because without the commentary, Noah isn't framed as a misunderstood visionary. He's just a man building an ark, for a reality no one around him had ever conceived. So when we picture Noah hammering for 120 years while the world laughs, remember, the laughter is ours, not his. The text doesn't record it. The ridicule is a mirror we've thrown into the story to measure faith, persistence, and yes, devotion that bends reality. I mean, we can all imagine how it could have been, right? There's this man in a world that never rained saying, oh my God, it's going to flood. I'm going to build an ark to save the animals and my family. Like, you need to repent so you can come in the ark as well. And that's another thing. Maybe he'd never even said, oh, repent and come and join the ark, because I don't see that narrative happening in the Bible either. So what, he preached? But what, out of everyone on the earth, and no one was good enough to go in that ark with Noah? Like, no one actually paid attention to that man that was ranting about rain? Like, not one soul believed his word? That is crazy. Now I'm going to have to go and dive again on it. But yeah, we can imagine people could have been, oh, what crazy man was he talking about? We don't even understand what he's saying. That is all fair enough. That could have happened, but it's not in the Bible. It wasn't important enough to even make it there to whoever was writing about what was going on in that time. What is bad is when the Bible teachings get twisted to control your behavior and your life. So in my teachings, it was like, look, Noah got mocked and everyone was calling him names, but he still persevered, he still believed in God, and he still completed his mission. And that's exactly how we have to be. We have to follow the same path as Noah. And, if people don't understand us, then, that is fine. Noah went through the same. So, again, like I said, it could have happened. Absolutely. They could have mocked him at all times. Absolutely. The problem is the narrative is not there, and it was only added later as a form of control. And then there's the ark's passenger list. Genesis chapter 7 verse 7 makes it clear. And Noah went in, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him into the ark, because of the waters of the flood. We have 8 people. Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives. That's it. But pause there. Where is everyone else? Like I just ranted. No brothers, no sisters, no extended family, no cousins, no community. If the whole world is corrupt, then fine, we can accept the absence. But the text doesn't even linger on the disappearance. It just compresses humanity down to a clean 8, like everything unnecessary has already been edited out. And what about the daughters-in-law? You don't hear their names, their voices. You don't hear if they even wanted to board. Just entry. Imagine being one of them. Your father-in-law has been hammering at this thing for over 100 years. He says the sky will fall. He says the whole world will drown. And now you're told to pack your things, climb into a box with elephants, and smile. Do you dare say no? Or do you step into the ark? Not because you believe, but because choice was never yours to begin with. So when the text called Noah righteous, we have to slow down and ask, was he righteous because he was good? Or righteous because he obeyed without question? Because if righteousness just means obedience without question, then maybe what God wanted wasn't morality. It was loyalty. Noah believes the unbelievable. He builds what has never existed. He commits his entire life to an unseen outcome. And when the rain finally comes, his family doesn't step in because they understand the vision. They step in because they are already inside his world, inside his obedience, inside his certainty, inside the consequence of his belief. Which leaves a disturbing possibility hanging in the air. If Noah's righteousness is obedience, then the flood isn't a reward for goodness. It's a test of compliance, not a separation of good and evil, but of those willing to build the impossible and those who are not given a choice not to. So Noah obeys. He builds the ark. And now comes the part every Sunday school mural loves best. The animals, 2 by 2, marching neatly into the ark like a well-trained circus act. Giraffes poking their heads out of the window. Elephants plodding side by side. A lion cuddled up with a lamb. It looks beautiful on the nursery wall. But the text itself? It's already splitting at the seams. In Genesis chapter 6 verse 19, 2 of every kind. Simple, manageable. But in Genesis chapter 7 verse 2, 7 pairs of the clean, 2 pairs of the unclean, and birds also by 7s. So which is it? 2 of each? Or 14 of some and 2 of others? Well, chapter 7 verses 8 and 9 clear that up for us. Of every clean animal, and of every animal that is not clean, and of the flying creatures, and of everything that moves on the ground, they went inside the ark to Noah by 2s, male and female, just as God had commanded Noah. I'll tell you something about this text. It just runs on magical math. We're back to animals by 2s, which makes sense, as that's the mural story, right? But wait, clean and unclean? How would Noah even know what counted as clean or unclean centuries before Moses supposedly received the law? But fine, let's pretend the numbers make sense. 2 of each or 14, whatever. Now picture the logistics. 3 decks, 1 door, 1 window. Thousands of animals. Predators and prey side by side. Lions staring at antelopes. Snakes coiled beside mice. A wolf pacing near a sheep. Who's feeding them? Who's hauling water? Who's shoveling mountains of waste? And who's stopping the carnivores from turning the ark into an all-you-can-eat buffet? 8 people. 8. That's it. 8 humans managing what is essentially a floating ecosystem crisis for over a year. Because despite the 40 days and 40 nights imagery, the text itself stretches the timeline much longer. Genesis chapter 7 verse 24 says, "And the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days." 5 months with no land in sight. And even after that, they still remain inside the ark waiting for the earth to dry. So this isn't a cozy little boat ride through rain. Imagine the stench, the noise, the sickness, the claustrophobia. This isn't a nursery mural anymore. It's a floating survival bunker. So the ark floats, the animals survive, the waters rise and cover the earth. Or so the story says. Genesis chapter 7 verses 19 and 20 paints it like this. "And the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and all the high hills that were under the whole heaven were covered. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered." All the hills, all the mountains under the whole heaven. A global flood, a total wipe. That's the version most of us were taught. One earth, one disaster, one ark bobbing on endless seas. But here's where the cracks begin to show. Because if the whole planet was underwater, where did the water go afterward? Water doesn't just disappear. It cycles, it evaporates, it shifts. But to cover Everest, you'd need 3 times the amount of water the Earth actually holds. And when it receded, where did it recede to? Mars? Yeah, the math doesn't work. So some scholars soften it. Maybe it wasn't global, maybe it was local. A massive Mesopotamian flood. The rivers Euphrates and Tigris bursting their banks. Civilizations drowning, farmland erased, memory scarred into myth. Archaeology has found flood layers in the region. Thick sediment in places like Shurupak dated around 2900 before Common Era. Enough to devastate the cradle of civilization. Enough to birth a legend. So maybe the flood wasn't worldwide. Maybe it was world-shaping for the people who lived through it. And honestly, that changes everything. Because ancient people didn't think globally the way we do. They didn't have satellites. They didn't have maps of Antarctica. They didn't know there were other continents beyond the horizon. The whole Earth often meant the known world, the civilized world, their world. So when Genesis says all flesh and all the earth, we have to ask, is this geography or perspective? And look at the pattern hidden underneath it all. Every time humanity expands beyond the boundaries set for it, the story responds with collapse. Cain builds a city, exile. Humanity multiplies before the flood, destruction. Babel unites humanity, confusion. Again and again, growth becomes threat, expansion becomes corruption, knowledge becomes danger, and the divine response is always the same: scatter, silence, reset. Which makes the flood feel less like weather and more like containment. Not just a natural disaster, not just punishment, a boundary being enforced. A reminder that when humanity grows too loud, too unified, too powerful, the heavens push back. Sort of feels similar to what is going on nowadays in the world, isn't it? I think humanity has actually grown too silent, too against each other, and too weak. And so we can't really push the control back that is being exercised. But that's a subject for another story. So maybe the real question isn't, did the whole world drown? Maybe the question is, whose world ended and who got to write the story afterward? And maybe that's why flood stories still grip us now. Because even today, people are still searching for the lost world before the waters. Writers like Graham Hancock built entire careers around the idea that an advanced civilization may have existed before recorded history, a culture wiped out by catastrophe, its survivors scattering fragments of knowledge into Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Americas. His theories exploded into the mainstream through shows like Ancient Apocalypse, and archaeologists absolutely hate them. Not because Hancock asks questions, but because he often leaps from possibility to conclusion, connecting myths and monuments with speculation rather than evidence. Still, the fact that these ideas resonate so deeply does say something. Maybe not about Atlantis, maybe not about a forgotten super civilization, but about us. Because humans seem haunted by the feeling that something was lost, some older memory, some fracture in the story, and whether that memory comes from real Ice Age catastrophes, regional floods retold across generations, or simply the eternal human fear of collapse, the pattern keeps returning. Again and again, a world destroyed, a few survivors, and the desperate hope that something sacred made it through the waters. And maybe that's exactly how ancient stories survive too. Not as perfect history, but as memory after trauma. And if all of this feels messy, it's because the seams keep showing, not just in Genesis, in myth itself. Because ancient stories love the phrase all the world, all flesh, everyone. But when you look closely, everyone usually means everyone who mattered to the storyteller. That's the trick of ancient narrative. The world is rarely the planet. It's the kingdom, the empire, the river valley, the civilization at the center of the map. Everyone outside that circle, barely counted. So when floods come, or kingdoms fall, or gods press reset, the text speaks in absolutes. All were destroyed. All perished. The earth was wiped clean. But archaeology, anthropology, even common sense keep whispering the same thing. Nope, not at all. And this isn't just a Genesis problem. Ancient scribes everywhere wrote history like a spotlight. Who stood in the light? Chosen people, kings, temple cities, sacred bloodlines. Who stayed outside it? Nomads, wanderers, tribes beyond the border, the inconvenient leftovers. Not always killed, just edited out. Because erasure is cleaner than contradiction. If the story says the world reset, you don't mention the villages still standing beyond the mountains. If the story says civilization began again, you don't mention the people who never disappeared in the first place. And if your bloodline is meant to look chosen, you quietly trim away everyone who complicates the claim. That's why these stories keep feeling both universal and strangely small at the same time. The language is cosmic, the reality is local. All the earth, but somehow centered on one region. All flesh, but somehow focused on one lineage. The end of the world, but mostly the end of their world. And maybe that's the real flood hidden underneath these stories. Not just water, narrative. A flood of retellings, a flood of edits, a flood of official versions washing away inconvenient memory. Because history is not just written by survivors. It's written by survivors who controlled the ink. And every time a story arrives too polished, too seamless, too absolute, it's worth asking, who got edited out? And this is where the question stops being purely mythological, because maybe ancient writers exaggerated. Maybe the whole world only meant the world they knew. But if Genesis is describing an actual global catastrophe, one that drowned every mountain, erased every civilization, bottlenecked every bloodline, then the earth itself should still carry the scar. The rocks should remember, the ice should remember, the oceans, the fossils, the DNA. So let's step out of the myth for a moment and ask the planet what it saw. They say the mountains were drowned, every peak, every height swallowed under water. But pause for a moment. The highest mountain we know, Everest, rises almost 9 kilometers above sea level. To sink it beneath a flood, Earth would need more water than it has ever held. Maybe that's why the gates of the deep and the windows of heaven had to open them so they would be able to swallow Everest whole, because if only the heavens opened, there wouldn't have been enough water to drown it. There you go. I don't know. There is no missing ocean, no secret reservoir in the sky. And yet, the rocks that make up Everest tell another story. Limestone, sandstone, fossils of seashells. Not because Noah's flood reached the summit, but because the Himalayas were once ancient seabeds pushed upward over millions of years as India collided with Asia. By the time Noah's story would have taken place, Everest already stood as a massive mountain. So yes, the sea once touched these rocks, but not in human history, in deep geological time. So the claim that water swallowed it whole, scientifically impossible, unless mountains in Genesis meant something else, not geography but security, the high ground, the last place you thought disaster could reach. A flood that drowns even the mountains is a flood that drowns certainty. It drowns the sense that anything, even the high ground, can save us. And maybe that's the point. Not a global flood filling the Himalayas, but a story of loss so total, so consuming, that it felt like the end of the world. But geology doesn't back a global deluge. There is no single flood layer blanketing the globe around 4,000 years ago, no universal deposit of silt or sand, no matching scars in the rock. What we do find are regional layers. In Mesopotamia, at places like Shurapak, like we mentioned earlier, archaeologists uncovered thick flood deposits dating to around 2,900 before Common Era. A flood big enough to drown cities, reset agriculture, scar memory. But not Everest, not the Andes, not the Sahara. The Earth remembers catastrophe, but not a global one. And then there's the ice. Greenland and Antarctica hold ice cores that stack back layer after layer like pages in a frozen book. Every snowfall, every season, preserved. Those records go back hundreds of thousands of years, unbroken. If the entire planet drowned 4,000 years ago, those layers would show a rupture, a chaos, a scar. They don't. They flow clean, season by season, flood-free. And if humanity really restarted with 8 people on a boat, our DNA would show a severe bottleneck, a sharp genetic narrowing recent enough to leave a clear signature. Now, we know humans have passed through bottlenecks before. Ice ages, disasters, near collapses, but nothing that neatly resets the entire species down to 8. Because when geneticists trace human ancestry, they don't find a bottleneck just a few thousand years ago. They find lineages branching far deeper. Mitochondrial Eve, around 150,000 years ago. Y-chromosomal Adam, closer to 200,000 years ago. Not Noah, not 4,000 years. Something older, something far less tidy. And even history rebels against the story, because while Noah is floating in Genesis, the Egyptians were already building dynasties. The Hindus' valley was thriving. China had cultures growing along the Yellow River. Civilizations that never reset. They kept building straight through the supposed flood window. So either the Bible forgot to drown them, or the flood wasn't global at all. If the dirt, the ice, the DNA all say no global flood, then maybe the flood isn't about water at all. And maybe the flood wasn't the globe at all. Maybe it was a world, a wound retold as if it drowned everything. But if the science strips away the Sunday school mural, what's left in the text itself? Because Genesis doesn't end with a flood. It ends with arrival. The waters recede, the ark groans, and Genesis chapter 8 verse 4 says, "And the ark rested upon the mountains of Ararat." Notice the word, not Mount Ararat, mountains of Ararat. Later traditions shrunk it to a single frozen peak in Turkey, but the Hebrew says Her Ararat, mountains, plural, and in Akkadian, Urartu, not a mountain at all, but a kingdom, a land of fortresses, vineyards, irrigation canals, iron workers and kings that even Assyria feared. So when the ark lands, it doesn't land in a void. It lands in someone's backyard, which means the mural of Noah's family as the only survivors starts to crack. Because how do you park a boat the size of a stadium in a region like that and no one notices? Where are the shepherds watching this impossible vessel settle into their mountains? Where are the stories of the people who saw lions, elephants, and doves stepping out of a wooden house? Genesis gives us none. It edits them out, drowns them not in water, but in silence. And then Noah turned not to neighbors, but to birds. First the raven, Genesis chapter 8 verse 7. And he sent forth a raven, which went forth to and fro, until the waters were dried up from off the earth. The raven never returns. It circles, it drifts over water that still holds corpses, a black shape against a grey sky. Across cultures, ravens cling to the edge of death and memory. In Celtic lore, the Morrigan, goddess of fate and war, appears in raven form over battlefields and slaughter. In Greek myth, Apollo's raven becomes a gnomon-bearer, transformed black after carrying devastating truth. And even in Norse tradition, ravens are tied to memory and thought, watchers carrying what the world refuses to forget. So Noah's raven becomes more than a scout. It is grief refusing to land, a witness circling the drowned world below. The raven doesn't return. It lingers with death. It keeps memory outside the ark. Then Noah sends a dove. Genesis chapter 8, verses 8 to 9 says Noah sent forth a dove to see if the waters had receded. But at first she returns empty. No branch, no rest, no proof. Then in verse 11, and the dove came in to him in the evening, and lo, in her mouth was an olive leaf plucked off. In Mesopotamia, the dove is sacred to Ishtar, goddess of love, fertility, and war. The dove represents life force, desire, reproduction, not passive innocence, but generative power, the force that brings life back. In Greek myth, the dove belongs to Aphrodite, symbol of attraction, union, and the pull toward life itself. And across traditions, the pattern repeats. Doves move between worlds. They carry messages. They return. And like the raven who lingers with death, the dove crosses the threshold and comes home. Later in Christian imagination, the dove becomes spirit itself, hovering at creation, descending at baptism, embodying peace. But even there, it doesn't just symbolize calm. It chooses where to land. So here the dove is not just a scout. It is the return of life, the signal of fertility. But life returning doesn't stay symbolic for long. It has to pass through bodies, through blood, through women. 8 people step off that ark, but only some of them carry the future. The dove brings the signal, but the continuation, that lives in the unnamed. The daughters-in-law. No names, no voices, no recorded consent. And yet, every generation after the flood would have to come through them. So when the dove returns with that olive leaf, it's not just peace, it's not just proof, it's a message carried straight into the ark. It's time. Not just for the world to begin again, but for life to be carried forward by those who were never asked. And the olive is no random leaf. Olive trees are ancient symbols of resilience, covenant, peace. But notice, the leaf was plucked, which means the dove didn't find floating debris. She tore it from a living tree, a tree that somehow survived beneath the flood. So even here the biology stutters. How did olive groves survive underwater? Maybe because the olive isn't about botany. It's about symbol, life insisting, promise alive. So the 2 birds together become a ritual. The raven, death, carrion, fate, memory that won't return. The dove, peace, fertility, promise, spirit descending back into the world. One circles the drowned. The other carries back the green of renewal. One stays outside. The other returns to the ark. Death and life, doom and promise. The raven keeps grief in the sky. The dove whispers hope into Noah's hand. The ark becomes not just a vault of animals, but a stage for omens, creation itself signaling that it is time to step out. And when Noah finally steps onto dry ground, the very first act isn't shelter, it's sacrifice. Genesis chapter 8 verse 20. And Noah builded an altar unto the Lord, and took of every clean beast, and of every clean fowl, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. The animals preserved with such effort, slaughtered at the threshold of survival. The ark saves, the altar consumes, life reduced to smoke. And suddenly those extra clean animals matter very much, because sacrifice only works if there are enough bodies left to burn. Unless the ark was never about numbers, unless it was always about blood. And here lies the greater silence. The ark carried pairs, but memory doesn't come in pairs. How many songs drowned? How many languages? How many remedies, crafts, lineages vanished in a single season? The text preserves animals. It doesn't preserve culture. So when Noah's altar smokes, it's not just worship. It's elegy, the cry of everything washed away. And for a moment it almost feels finished. The waters retreat, the birds return, the survivors step onto dry ground. The world breathes again. But Genesis never lets the relief last, because almost immediately the story turns inward, away from the waters, away from the ark, and into the family itself, into wine, into nakedness, into shame, because the flood may have ended outside, but whatever fractured humanity in Eden walked straight out of the ark with them. Genesis chapter 9, verse 20 and 21. And Noah began to be an husbandman, and he planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine, and was drunken, and he was uncovered within his tent. That word husbandman doesn't mean husband, as in married man. It means farmer. In Hebrew, ish ha-adamah, man of the ground, which is interesting, isn't it? Adam came from the ground, Cain worked the ground, and now Noah, the reset of humanity, returns to it too. The flood ends, and humanity goes straight back to the soil. So the righteous survivor of the flood becomes a cultivator, a grower of grapes. And the very first thing he does in this new world? He plants vines, he brews wine, he gets drunk, and he collapses naked. Not exactly the glowing Sunday school hero standing beside a rainbow. Ham, the father of Canaan, walks in. He sees his father's nakedness, and he tells his brothers. Shem and Japheth take a garment, walk backward into the tent, and cover Noah without looking at him. The scene feels strangely charged for such a tiny moment. Genesis tells it with almost uncomfortable precision. Who looked, who didn't, who covered, who turned away. And then Noah wakes, and suddenly the story detonates. Genesis chapter 9, verse 25. Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren. Not Ham, Canaan. And this is where the story starts slipping under the skin, because Ham is the one who sees. Ham is the one who speaks, but the curse falls sideways, onto his son. A whole bloodline marked because of one moment in a tent, and the punishment is enormous compared to the act. Noah gets drunk, Noah collapses naked, Ham sees him. And somehow this becomes generational servitude? The scale feels off, like there's something underneath the text we're no longer being told. And do you feel the echo here? Back in Eden, Adam and Eve suddenly became aware of nakedness. Shame enters the story. Now here, after the flood, after the supposed reset of creation, nakedness returns again. Exposure, shame, punishment. The same rhythm repeating. It's almost like Genesis can't stop circling the same wound. And if you remember the Forbidden Scrolls, Noah was never described as ordinary to begin with. His birth terrified his own father. Lamech fears the child looks angelic, different, unnatural, radiant skin, eyes like sunlight, a child who doesn't look fully human. Enoch reassures the family that Noah is chosen, but the anxiety never fully leaves the story. So when Ham sees Noah naked, some later readers began wondering if this was about more than embarrassment, more than a drunk old man passed out in a tent. Because in ancient texts, seeing nakedness can carry layers underneath the literal: exposure, vulnerability, sexual violation, forbidden knowledge, something uncovered that should have remained hidden. And this is where later traditions spiral hard into speculation. Some rabbinic interpretations say Ham mocked Noah. Others say he assaulted him. Some even claim Ham castrated Noah, which would explain why Noah's response is so extreme. And another tradition goes further still, that Ham slept with Noah's wife, making Canaan the product of that violation. None of this is directly stated in Genesis. The text itself is crazy vague, but the fact that so many traditions tried to fill the silence tells you something. People knew the punishment didn't seem to match the surface-level story, so they started searching underneath it. And maybe that's the real tension sitting inside this passage. Not just nakedness, not just shame, but exposure. A family line exposed, a patriarch exposed, something seen that destabilized the entire structure. Because Genesis is obsessed with bloodlines, chosen lines, cursed lines, preserved lines. And after all the flood imagery, after all the talk of purification and starting over, the very first story in the new world is another fracture in the family, another curse, another wound passed forward into the generations. The flood was supposed to wash corruption away, but it didn't take long for shame to walk back into the tent. And maybe that's the point Genesis can't hide. The waters reset the world, but not the people inside the ark. The tent is small. The story feels domestic, almost petty. A drunk father, a naked body, a son who sees, a curse that falls sideways. But the curse didn't stay in the tent. It leaked, it spread, and it became one of the most poisonous interpretations in human history. The text we mentioned earlier, Genesis chapter 9, verse 25, that says, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren." At face value, it's already brutal. Because it's not Ham, the one who saw, but Canaan, his son. And not just him, but his descendants. A whole lineage stamped with servitude. But history wasn't content to leave the verse alone. It was stretched, expanded far beyond the tent it came from, and eventually it was used to chain millions. Early Jewish traditions already wrestled with the problem. Why Canaan and not Ham? But once Christianity fused itself to empire, the story mutated. By late antiquity and into the medieval world, some commentators began linking Ham's descendants to Africa, and slowly the curse drifted from Canaan to Ham, from one family line to entire peoples. By the time European colonizers crossed oceans, Genesis chapter 9 had become the so-called Curse of Ham. Never mind that the text never curses Ham. Never mind that Canaan's descendants were associated with the ancient Near East, not sub-Saharan Africa. The rewrite had already happened. From the 15th to the 19th centuries, this interpretation became a weapon. Preachers used it to defend slavery. Slave traders carried it like divine paperwork. Plantation owners quoted it against abolitionists. A single verse from Noah's tent was transformed into theology for empire. The curse of Ham was used to sanctify colonialism, to justify racial hierarchy, to dress white supremacy in biblical language. And here's the disturbing part. The original passage was never about race, not skin, not continents. It was a family story, a vineyard, a tent, a curse born from shame and exposure. But once power got hold of it, the story became infrastructure. And the echoes never fully disappeared. You still hear fragments of it in racialized theology, in colonial narratives dressed up as civilizing missions, in the idea that domination can somehow be divinely ordered. The curse stopped being read as tragedy. It became permission. And this is the deeper pattern Genesis keeps circling. Chosen lines, cursed lines, preserved lines. Again and again, bloodlines become destiny. One family is blessed, another marked, another pushed downward beneath the weight of the story. So the real flood wasn't only water. It was narrative, a flood of interpretation powerful enough to shape empires, redraw human value, and turn ancient myth into social order. All from a tent, all from a vineyard, all from a curse. And if scripture can be stretched that far, then the question isn't only what the text says, it's who benefits from the way it's told. And Genesis does something almost unsettling after this. It doesn't pause to reflect on the curse. It doesn't question it. Instead, it immediately starts listing names. Sons, sons of sons, nations born from bloodlines. Because this is where the family drama stops being private. This is where genealogy becomes geography, where ancestry becomes politics, where the curse leaves the tent and spreads across the map. Genesis chapter 10, the part everyone skips. The genealogy chapter, the endless sons of sons of sons that make your eyes glaze over 5 minutes into a Bible study. But this chapter matters, because this isn't really a family tree. It's a map. After the flood, Genesis redraws the world through Noah's sons. 3 branches, 3 destinies, 3 ways of sorting humanity. At first it sounds harmless. just names, just ancestry. But watch closely. Shem becomes the sacred line, the ancestors of Abraham, Israel, covenant, promise. Japheth becomes expansion, movement outward, the nations that spread. And Ham? Ham becomes the problem branch, the line tied to Egypt, Canaan, Cush, the lands Israel would later fight, fear, conquer, or define itself against. So already the text is doing something subtle. These aren't just Noah's children anymore. They're categories, civilizations, moral geography disguised as genealogy. And Genesis starts attaching entire regions to these bloodlines. Mizraim becomes Egypt. Cush points toward Nubia or Ethiopia. Canaan becomes the land Israel will later invade. Then Japheth's descendants stretch toward the northern regions, places later associated with Anatolia, the Greeks, the distant coastlands. And Shem's line? That's where the Hebrews emerge. It's all incredibly neat. Too neat. Like someone took the chaos of the ancient world and sorted it into tidy family folders. Because history doesn't actually work like this. Cultures weren't sealed into separate bloodlines. People mixed constantly. Cultures weren't sealed into separate bloodlines. People mixed constantly. They traded, married, migrated, fought, absorbed each other. Human history is messy, but Genesis organizes the world as if nations themselves inherited moral roles. Shem is chosen, Japheth is expanded, and Ham is cursed. And suddenly Noah's family drama stops being private, it becomes political. So when people say Genesis 10 is just genealogy, no, it's worldview, a way of sorting humanity into inherited roles, blessed lines, expanded lines, cursed lines. The flood didn't just reset the earth, it reset the map of belonging. And once you see that, Genesis stops reading like simple history. It starts reading like narrative architecture, a story arranging the world into categories, deciding who stands at the center and who gets pushed to the edges. The rainbow fades, the ground dries, Noah plants his vineyard, the world is supposed to be new. But the cracks keep showing. The ark lands in a kingdom, not a void. The raven circles death. The dove carries life back into the ark. The altar burns the very creatures meant to be saved. Ham sees, shame multiplies, and a curse spills forward into generations. The flood was supposed to end corruption, but corruption survived the voyage. It walked down the ramp with Noah's sons. And maybe that's the part no one says out loud. The flood was never final. Maybe it was never even all the earth in the way we imagined. Maybe it was memory retold as totality, a regional catastrophe expanded into cosmic language, a world-ending event for the people inside it. Because floods don't need to drown the whole planet to feel like the end of creation. They only need to drown your world. And so, we're left with the question Genesis never fully answers. Did the flood actually change humanity? Or did humanity simply survive long enough to repeat itself? And that's another Bloodline episode done. Thank you so much if you stuck around. I hope you enjoyed going down this journey through the waters. And if you've got threads of your own, questions, or just say hello, or just come and drop us a thread, or I don't know, just come and share whatever you feel like sharing with me. You can follow on Instagram at Bloodline Myths, on TikTok, on Bloodline A Story We Forgot to Tell, or I hope that's how it is in there. Apparently it's the other way around. And on TikTok, you will find little precious stones of threads that I find as I'm doing the research for the episodes, and I come across other threads on TikTok. There's all the extras over there. And if you prefer YouTube, you have Bloodline, A Story We Forgot to Tell channel there as well. And if you like the soundtracks behind the episodes, you can also find us on SoundCloud at Bloodline Myths. There's personal soundtracks, there's soundtracks of the episodes, and there's collaborations with the amazing writer Elodie from Viagens Obscuras. Hello Elodie, hello Inês, hope you're doing okay. Thank you for all the support and for all the love that you've been sharing. And a great shout out for Viagens Obscuras. Anyway, if you are Portuguese and you are listening to me and you like true crime, paranormal, anything obscure in the world, they are two friends that just go into it all, and they have a fantastic energy, and they are great, great people. And while you're there on SoundCloud, do pop over Hympenology's channel. Go and have a listen. There's literally a genre for everyone. You have Psy, you have dance EDM, you have rock, you have rap, you have literally every genre possible in that channel. You have frequency music, literally everything that you can possibly enjoy, it's there. And listen to the lyrics. They do tell a story lived, and a story still being lived. Do show us your support by following, by rating, and by sharing us around. It does go a long, long way.
Follow, rate, comment, share. It generally helps more than you know. New episodes every 3 weeks. Until next time, and remember, if anyone ever tells you the story is simple, you probably haven't reached the floodwaters yet. Bye.
Goodbye, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful time, week, month, until I see you again in 3 weeks. Bye-bye.